2019 marks year 3 for the Trump presidency. Joining me now is David Stockman. David, great to have you here today.
Glad to be with you.
Well, let's start out by talking about your book, Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA. Now, that is a long title, so let's start out by talking about Peak Trump. Why is September 2018 an important date?
Well, because the S&P 500 peaked at 2940, the absolute all-time bubble of everything. It happened to be exactly 800 points above where it was on election night, 2140. At the time, Trump properly said that we're in one big, fat, ugly bubble. 800 points later, it was only bigger, fatter, and uglier. And for reasons that are unfathomable, he embraced it. And all of a sudden pivoted from attacking the failed Fed and the failed Obama economy to embracing what was only what I would call the rigor mortis of a bull market that was dead and just didn't know it yet. Okay, so I say it's all downhill from here. This was not sustainable, not so supportable. He made a huge rookie mistake by embracing a bubble that he inherited. He should have taken a leaf, as I say, from President Reagan's book. President Reagan, for the first 3 years, never stopped attacking Jimmy Carter's failed economy and the Democrats' mistakes in the 4 years that they were in office. And finally, when the economy went through the ringer and we had the Great Recession and Volcker succeeded in finally choking off inflation, then he said it's morning again in America, and he could take credit for an economy that, at least for a while, performed a lot better. Trump has gone in the opposite direction. He's such an egomaniac. He is so focused on the by the hour and by the day and his own importance in the whole scheme that he has embraced something that's going to take him down. Because I was in Washington in the early 70s when Nixon was elected by a landslide in 1972. He won, I think it was something like 500 electoral votes to 28. He won a huge popular election victory. He was invincible. The stock market was at an all-time high. Now here's the point. 18 months later, the stock market was down 37%. 18 months later, Nixon was basically put on what I call the Dick Nixon Memorial Helicopter and sent out of town for his last ride. So when the market goes down, the Republicans, who have been basically hiding along the ditches and keeping quiet, are going to come out with guns blaring. We needed a disruptor to sort of throw his body into the gears and stop the machine and at least create some disorder in Washington. And that's what he's doing, and I think that's good. But on the other hand, for all these supporters out in Red America who thought that he was, Red State America, who thought he was going to save the day, that Trumponomics, whatever you want to call it, is going to make America great again, that's nonsense. He has no program. His program is to borrow and spend and, have unnecessary trade wars and border wars and so forth.
So maybe it wasn't just a rookie mistake then? Maybe it was intentional?
Oh, I think it was a rookie mistake.
Yeah?
I mean, I think Trump has no clue about politics. He spent his whole life as, a speculator and real estate developer, and he knows how to borrow a lot of money and then somehow blame someone else when the problem finally emerges. I think he's just sliding by the seat of his pants, playing it by the hour, and by every day he gets up and tweets whatever is on his mind. So he's a disruptor, but he's a chaotic disruptor. He's not a strategic disruptor.
Well, you've gotten to the second half of your book title. You've addressed the fantasy of MAGA, but what about the undrainable swamp? Now, it's interesting. Prior to our interview, I learned that Washington, D.C. wasn't necessarily built on a swamp per se. So why is it referred to as this undrainable swamp?
Well, it's undrainable because if you go across the Potomac, there is a swamp. That's where they built the Pentagon. And I say the deep end of the swamp is on the other side of the Potomac. It's the military-industrial surveillance complex. It's the $800 billion that we're spending, massively more than we need for a legitimate defense. And Trump, because he doesn't really have any view on anything, got sold a bill of goods that the military needed a massive increase in its budget. He gave them 80 billion, which is going to be totally wasted. We can't afford. And it is really the military-industrial foreign aid complex, the empire as I call it, all of our far-flung interventions and occupations and bases and meddling in every nation in the world, that's where the swamp comes from. Okay, the swamp isn't because a bunch of people are getting food stamps. That program can be reformed, but those people don't have any political power. They don't even vote for the most part. The swamp is the money going to the Pentagon, to the State Department, to the all of these propaganda operations like the National Endowment for Democracy and Voice of America and all the rest of this stuff. It's a total waste of money, but there are tens of thousands of people in Washington living very high on the hog, making very high incomes, who have an interest in keeping the gravy train flowing and therefore finding problems around the world for us to meddle in that are none of our business. What the hell were we doing in Syria, Libya, Iraq, the Ukraine, Crimea? None of our business. Yet all of these people make it Washington's business. That's the swamp, and that's you know, it's two places: Foggy Bottom, what they call Foggy Bottom, that's the State Department, and the Pentagon.
So this is what you refer to in your book as the warfare state versus the welfare state.
The warfare state. The welfare state is bankrupting us. Because it costs $2.5 trillion a year, and it's going to rise dramatically because of the baby boom retirement. The warfare state is just, you know, adding more kindling to the fire because we don't need $800 billion to defend ourselves. I mean, the Russians spend 60. Okay, so why do we need to spend $800 billion on our empire, as I call it, when the Russians only spend 60? And, you know, they don't even have a navy, okay, blue water navy. They're not going to invade New Jersey. What are they going to do, drop some nukes on New York City? It's crazy. There is no threat from Russia, and frankly, the proof of the pudding is the Europeans. If they thought that Putin was some kind of latter-day Hitler and was about ready to mobilize his army across Europe, they would be spending more than 1% of GDP on defense. The Germans are not pacifists. They've proved that several times in the last century. They spend 1% of GDP, $40 billion, and they got an economy 3 times bigger than Russia. Are they afraid that you know, the Red Army is going to be coming through the Brandenburg Gates? No. So this is all Washington fear-mongering, because that's how they keep the budget at these bloated levels, and that's how they keep the Congress pacified and confused.
Well, while we're talking about defense and while we're discussing all of the spending and expenditure, I want to get your take on NATO. Now, I know that you've mentioned this before, and granted that the U.S. has the highest expenditure when we're talking about their spending for NATO. Can you present your argument and give the viewing audience an understanding of where you stand?
Sure. I mean, what's the point of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, set up in 1949 to contain the Soviet Union, which at that time was 400 billion people and 400 million people, covered most of Eastern Europe and all of the old Soviet Union. All of that is gone. They had 50,000 tanks on the so-called Central Front or Warsaw Front. All of those have been melted down for scrap. Okay, so NATO's mission was completed in 1991. They should have said, mission accomplished, disbanded NATO. At the time, actually, the first Bush and Jim Baker, the Secretary of State, promised Gorbachev, in return for the unification of Germany, East and West, that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch to the east. We have added 15 countries to NATO. Why do we have Slovenia? Why do we have Montenegro in NATO? What's the whole point of it? It is a complete relic, obsolete, and typical government agency that's in the business of finding missions and excuses to continue to have a budget. It's actually, NATO today is the biggest threat to peace in the world, because they need a mission and they're nosing around constantly everywhere trying to stir up trouble.
And last but not least, David, you dedicated this book to your 20-month-year-old granddaughter.
Right.
Now, even today here in New York, we're seeing warmer weather, temperatures, and rain, which doesn't seem that seasonable for the month of January. So we have to worry about the climate, fiscal
I don't know.
policy, and
3 days
government.
ago it was so cold you couldn't go outside. Okay?
Exactly.
So I don't think the problem is warming climate. I think the problem is a bankrupting country. I think the problem is born and unborn taxpayers are going to be footing a bill for decades and decades, and for the remainder of this century, that will produce nothing for them. They're going to pay for our mistakes, for our wars, for all of the waste and inefficiency and pork barreling and that goes on in Washington. And I think that's a real tragedy. And I don't know how it can be stopped at this point.
So do you have an investing strategy for your granddaughter at this point?
Well, I would say until we get the bubble cleared, it would be best for whatever trust funds she's going to have, not to put it in the stock market.
Okay, David, well, thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks for all your insight regarding your upcoming book, Peak Trump.
Thank you.